Africa and Asia in the early modern period. The early modern period runs from about anywhere from, I guess, the 1630s until the immediate period before the French Revolution. So we're basically talking from the 1630s until about the 1780s. So we're going to take a look at Africa and Asia in the early modern period. The early modern period runs from about anywhere from, I guess, the 1630s until the immediate period before the French Revolution. So we're basically talking from the 1630s until about the 1780s. Here we've got just some maps of Korea and China. As you can see, Korea is located here right next to China. So for most of its history, it's usually been connected to China. Even to this day, the Communist Revolution of Korea was actually started by and supported by Chinese communists. So the famous war we'll talk about near the end of the course, the Korean War or the Korean conflict, was a fight over communist ideas in Korea. Even today, our foreign power, our diplomacy, American diplomacy, tries to use China to try to control North Korea because of that close cultural and political relationship. Some important events we can mention. We have the Koreans had to repel a Japanese invasion. At one point in time, the Japanese almost conquered Korea. The only thing that stopped them, however, was reinforcement from the China side. So Korea has always had a very close relationship. During the 17th century, the Manchus did make Korea part of their empire, only we call it a satellite state or a tributary state. The Manchus forced the Chosen dynasty to actually pay them a yearly fee to remain independent. And the Koreans had to basically run most of their large decisions through the Chinese government for them to be okay. Okay. In terms of Japanese history, in the early modern period, we enter the phase which is called the Shogunate era of Japanese history. Shogunate era of Japanese history lasts from roughly about the 1300s to about the 1800s. Has anybody seen the movie The Last Samurai?
Yeah.
If you've seen that movie takes place in the aftermath of the breakdown of the shogun and the samurai culture. Question, Ms. Lane.
Okay, so that movie that just came out, The Mummy, but it was like about the Chinese part, and it was like in war, whatever.
The Mummy 3?
Yeah.
That actually is about Chinese history thousands of years ago. I believe the actor in that, Jet Li, he is a guy named Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of China.
Right.
He dates to about 220 BCE. Now, the movie The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise, that movie takes place approximately in the 1860s CE or AD. And what happened is prior to that time period, and we'll talk about the 1860 revolution, prior to 1861, the type of government that we had was called a shogunate. And what a shogun is a shogun for the Japanese was a military leader. He controlled or was the most powerful of the military leaders. Now, throughout this entire period, the Japanese had an emperor. And in fact, the Japanese believed their emperor was a physical god on earth. He is the son or the daughter, if she's female, the empress. She is the son or the daughter of the moon goddess. And so For all of their history, all of their imperial history, the Japanese believed that their ruler was a physical god or goddess on earth. However, because they were gods or goddesses, they weren't supposed to deal with government. Their job was to basically look out for the people of Japan by avoiding floods or bad storms or supernatural capabilities.
This is the emperor, isn't it?
Yes.
So who deals with them?
Well, different agencies during the 1300s to about to the 1800s, we had the rise of these military leaders called shoguns. And what the shogun would do is they would isolate the emperor from his people. So he still, in theory, ruled everything. He didn't actually make any decisions. And the shogun would actually make all the decisions. Now, the last of the shogunates is called the Tokugawa shogunate. And we define this type of government as a feudal government. Now, what that means is the shogun controlled the best area of Japan. He collected taxes from it. He had an army. He had his samurai, which helped him. And then he would basically distribute pieces of land out to different lords, different samurai. And they would actually control and manage those pieces of land. And if the shogun needed them, like for the invasion of Korea, what he would do is he would send out notice that all of the lords, all the samurai, should collect their armies and travel to meet him. And they would all merge into one giant army. So that means basically power was held by the shogun, but it was also distributed out among his subordinates. Question?
Okay, so where did like the symbol of the dragon come from? Like, did that symbol of like one of their gods or something?
The symbol of the dragon is predominantly Chinese.
Oh.
Yeah, usually the Chinese have an emphasis on dragon mythology. The Japanese, not so much.
Was the shogun, was that basically like generals or?
Well, the shogun was like, for example, would be like our president, commander-in-chief. The real limit to his power, though, everything was based on respect. And so the key to the shogunate system was a respect in the shogun that he could get done what he threatened people with.
So the emperor didn't really do anything?
The emperor didn't do anything.
Like a high priest or something?
Well, he was a god. So he just basically sat in his palace and ate and was... the shoguns purposely isolated the emperor from any other people so that they would only know what the shogun told them. Okay? Now, the reason why this is kind of important, though, is the shogunate, the Japanese shogunate, was anti-Western. They actually expelled all the Jesuits that lived there and were trying to convert the population to Christianity. And for about 150, 160 years, they were completely cut off from the Western world. It was actually illegal for a foreigner to set foot in Japan. One of the big problems we had in the 1800s is sometimes our sailors were out trying to hunt and kill whales. And every now and then the whale would destroy the boat. And so our sailors would wash up on Japanese coasts. Well, they wouldn't get shot. The Japanese would give them a bottle of water, put them on a raft, and ship them back out.
What?
Because they weren't allowed to stay. And we got tired of that. In the 1860s, we sent over a gentleman by the name of Commodore Perry to make a treaty with the Japanese. And when they refused to talk to him, he bombed Tokyo. But we'll talk about that a little later. It's called big stick diplomacy. You beat people with a big stick long enough and they'll listen. During this time period, however, we have this continuation The shogun, his subordinates, ran, like I say, they ran these areas. The warrior class were called samurai. They were equatable to what you might know as knights. All they did was fight. They trained all their lives to be warriors. You didn't have it. Well, they were an army, but it was a very small army. Most of your Japanese people were not military. They were not lords. They were only farmers. This is also the age of the ninja. So, sometimes people find that interesting.
I was about to ask you.
Yes,
Was
Mr. Owen.
Shogun elected, or did they kill you, or what?
Yes, to both. They could be elected, but most of the time they were the biggest, meanest group there. We're going to have, in case you're wondering, there are 3 shogunates that take place in this time period. So they last for hundreds of years, these families. And some of these shogunates actually wound up going into business afterward. So, for example, in the news today, of course, very prominent, Toyota. Japanese businesses are what we call zabaitsu, and they actually are monopolies ran by conglomerations of families, some of which date back to this period and beyond.
Well, they got a restaurant in Cape called Shogun. It's good.
Well,
And sushi and all.
I don't know about that, but I can tell you, if you want to read about this, there's actually a very, very long miniseries called Shogun, which was popular in the 70s. It's okay, but eventually what we're going to see, which we'll talk about, is the complete breakdown of this type of government that occurs by the Japanese a little later when we talk about what's called the Meiji Restoration. Any questions about Japan?
So Japan cut off from the Western world so that they could keep their religion they didn't want.
Well, they didn't want to have anything to do with the outside world. They wanted to isolate them, cut themselves off. And in the long run, like I say, in the 1850s and 60s, we wanted them to talk to us. So we opened it back up.
Trying to explain to it that, yeah, it could, if it really wanted to. Ooh, I think it's cold in here.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's cold in here today. now the PowerPoints say unauthorized.
What's that?
Hello? Yeah. He is set up, his class is going, he's imported the textbook, and he's sending out messages every other hour to his students to get online and work.
So, Japan, consisting of 4 islands, Hokkaido, Honshu, Shikoku, and can't remember. Here we have China, of course. Taking a look at India, we're going to take a look at India in the 1700s. The area that's colored orange is what we call the Mughal Empire.
I said he picked the assignments based on Maryland's syllabus, so everybody should be happy at this point. But, yeah, let's hope.
We have the Mughals, who would rule parts of India for almost, more than 300 years. The Mughal dynasty was an offshoot of Islamic and Mongolian ancestry. They started out ruling modern-day Pakistan and migrated into India. They waged almost a 300-year war trying to exterminate Hinduism. Islamic tradition, Muslim tradition, is to destroy polytheistic religions. And Hinduism was and remains the 3rd largest polytheistic religion in the world. Question, Ms. Lynn.
What's polytheistic?
They worship more than one god. So the Mughals started out conquering northern India, and over the course of centuries, they pushed their control over most of India. Now, the reason why the Mughals are important is because in the 1600s, they went ahead and decided to lease out some of their land. They leased it out to a company called the East India Company, which you may be familiar with, otherwise known as the British East India Company. You are probably familiar with, I think we talked about its component, its western component called the British West India Company. If you've seen the movies Pirates of the Caribbean,
That's my stuff.
they're the bad guys.
What? Like Johnny Depp's side of the bad guy?
No.
They're the dudes with the wig.
They're the dudes with the wig. Yeah. They're the members of the British government. They were hired by the British government to run this company. And the goal of this company was only one goal: making money. In the New World, they began to sell slaves and spices to the New World colonies. In the East, they were called the British East India Company, and starting in 1601, they began to lease tracts of land from the Mughal government, paying them rent. And what went with this rent, was the idea that the British could set up their own factories, they could set up their own businesses, and be governed by their own laws on their land. And starting in the 1600s, they held a monopoly of all European trade with India. They basically got the Mughals to sign an agreement saying they would only trade with the British. And what did they trade? Chinese, mostly Chinese and Indian spices. Teas, things of that nature. Did we talk about food? Why spice was so important?
Yeah. Makes it better.
To at least match the taste, yeah. So, the British government in the 1600s, remember how we talked about how Spain was so rich? In the 1600s, the British government made lots of money basically selling spices. And they did it because they controlled the trade contract with the Mughal Empire. From 1600 forward, the British government gradually increased the amount of rent they paid to the Mughals as they increased the amount of land they controlled. By 1765, they controlled all of the Indian region known as Bengal. By 1800, the British began to control more and more land until finally in 1858 they told the Mughals they were not going to pay any more rent. And then they told the Mughals to retire because they no longer were needed. When the Mughals tried to stop, the British government basically attacked them and dissolved them. So, the story of India is one of control by the Mughals, and then what happens over 200 years, 250 years, is the Mughals lose control of India to the British. And they lose control without even paying attention. Because what the British would do is they'd say, look, we'll give you more money to control more of your land. And the Mughals just wanted the money. So they said, sure. And over the course of centuries, controlling just like a town like Jeff City became controlling Missouri, then became controlling the Midwest, and then it became controlling almost all the 50 states. And when that happened, the British government said, we don't need to pay you rent anymore. We outnumber you, we control more of your land than you do. So consider this, as Donald Trump would say, you're fired. You're done. So 1858, we have the end of the Mughal dynasty, and from 1858 until the 1950s, the British government ruled India like they owned it. They ruled it as one of their colonies. In the grand scheme of things, America was very insignificant to the amount of money that the British made from India. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. This lecture kind of sets up a lot of what we're going to talk about down the road. Now, the last place we have to look is Africa. At this point in time, by the way, this was the Mughal dynasty at its largest extent, and pretty much the British took most of this from them without having to fight for it. They just kept upping their rent payments. Moving on to Africa, the areas of exploration of Africa are all going to be limited to the coast of Africa. Now, we talked about the big push to find a way to trade with India and China without transporting your goods over land. Christopher Columbus incorrectly said it was to go around the world. The first route was to sail down the coast of Africa and then back up. When that happened, the first country to do it, the Portuguese, set up colonies and trading posts all along the coast. They did not, however, ever try to set up colonies inside Africa. Does anybody know why? Anybody know the nickname of Africa? That's one nickname. Its first nickname was the Dark Continent. And the reason for that is because Africa went unexplored by the Western world.
The dark what?
The Dark Continent. It was also known by another name, White Man's Graveyard. Because anybody from Europe, any European who tried to travel into Africa, into the center part of Africa, usually died. Does anybody know why? No? No? They died. A disease. Anybody know? Malaria. Malaria was one disease Europeans did not have an immunity to. And so the tropical conditions of Central Africa led to a very widespread epidemic of malaria. Does anyone know what how to prevent malaria? Anyone Everyone know a natural remedy? Mr. Lukoff? Sickle cell anemia. If you've heard of that, if you have sickle cell anemia, you will not get malaria.
You're sick though.
Well, sickle cell, you still sick.
Well, but you won't get malaria. Sickle cell sickle cell anemia means that your blood cells are shaped like sickles rather than looking like, I don't know, muffin tops or whatever. And the problem with it is as they travel through your body, they get hung up and they break. However, malaria is transported by mosquitoes. And a mosquito will not give you malaria if you have sickle cell anemia.
Why?
The disease can't live, it lives in the blood cells. It can't survive. So, sickle cell anemia was a trait that became very prevalent in Central Africa among Africans because it was a natural bound defense to malaria. We trace its origins back to Central Africa. So, getting back to our outline here, the problem for the Europeans was Africa was an area they could not go to. They could not set up stable colonies except on the very coast. All that changed, however, in the 1800s because the Western world developed a cure for malaria. A preventative cure as well as a cure for it. We call it quinine. If anybody's familiar with soldiers in Afghanistan, they take quinine because malaria is in Afghanistan. And if you take quinine, you can reduce the spread or the development of malaria. So, we've already seen some of this.
Bye.
What happens in terms of Africa is a tragedy for the African people. Starting in the 1450s, 1440s, we have the exploration of the coast of Africa. We have these trading posts set up. We do have a stable colony started. First colony in Africa, of course, is South Africa. Starting in 1441, we have the beginning of what's called the transatlantic slave trade. We have the beginning of the Western Europeans, the Portuguese. They begin to buy slaves in Africa and take them back to Europe. Question, Miss Lane?
Is it true that their king or some king or something like that over in Africa actually like traded his people for like money?
Yes. Well, not mainly money, mostly guns. Now, you got to keep in mind, West Africa, that coast of Africa, had been trading slaves for hundreds of years. They'd been trading slaves amongst themselves. The key to African slavery, or what we call ancient slavery, was very simple. A person was a slave for one reason. Does anyone know why?
To work? They won't work.
How did you become a slave?
You had to do that.
No. You were conquered in war. The ancient world had what's called the rule of spoil. Anyone ever heard of that? If you conquered somebody, you got what they had. You got their possessions, you got their land, you got their people. They were your slaves then. The Romans, the Greeks, every ancient civilization practiced slavery. But it was what we call ancient slavery. It was warfare slavery. The Africans in West Africa practiced warfare slavery. What happens in the 1400s is we have the Europeans get involved and they're going to change slavery. It's going to become what we call racial slavery. Not based on conquering, but based on race, based on heritage. In the ancient world, if a slave had children, those children were not slaves. Slavery only extended to the person conquered. When the Europeans get involved, when it becomes genetic slavery or racial slavery, slavery is passed down through the generations. It started in 1441, fairly small and isolated. The Western Africans wanted to trade with the Europeans because they wanted guns. Superior technology. We have our coastal colony in South Africa. We have the Portuguese invade Congo in 1685. They destroy one of the largest African civilizations at that time. Slavery starts out being fairly small, but it's going to continue with the discovery of the New World. Remember, we talked about it. What did the Spanish take and put into the New World?
Plantations.
They put their plantations there. Plantations require cheap labor. And so now we have a need for cheap labor. Initially, the Spanish enslaved the Native Americans. But over time, the Native American populations dwindled because of disease. Smallpox, other diseases that the Europeans brought with them. And so what happened is, of course, in the 1500s, those Spanish colonies needed more workers. And so the Portuguese, initially, later the Dutch, would pick up African slaves, trading guns for African slaves. They would then hook over to the New World, Central and South America, and trade Africans for sugar. And then they would take sugar back up to Europe. Why is sugar so important? Tea? Not bad in tea, but it's more important than that. Anybody know why? What do you make out of sugar?
Cakes and stuff.
What's that, Miss Bailey?
Beer, liquor.
Not beer.
Liquor.
Not, well, it's a form of liquor, yes. Rum. Miss Lane, your favorite movie?
Homicide.
Well, the Pirates of the Caribbean?
Oh, okay.
Rum. The main production of rum is based on, of course, sugar. So what happened is the sugar would be taken back to Europe, made into rum, and then traded back down. We call it the triangular trade. Europe to Africa to the New World and back. Now what happened is these African kingdoms became extremely powerful because they had Western technology. They needed more. What did they need to get more?
Slaves.
They needed slaves. Once they'd already depleted their slave markets, how do they get more? By conquering new Africans. And so what happened is the African kingdoms on the coast began to move farther into Africa to get those populations. They would conquer them and then transport them back to the coast and then trade them to the Dutch to be taken to the New World.
So, the African colonies on the coast were...
Not the African colonies, the African governments. These were Africans.
Were conquering other Africans and...
Selling them into slavery.
Okay.
Because they needed the weaponry. They wanted the guns. Now, starting in the 1600s and 1700s, the Dutch push out the Portuguese, and the Dutch take over the trade. We have high mortality rates, and we see a constant drain of population out of Africa. African slaves have a longer survival rate in North America. What are they growing?
Cotton.
Well, not cotton at this time. It's tobacco. Harvesting tobacco is a lot different than harvesting sugarcane. The farms we're talking about here are smaller. They're not the large-scale plantations that you see in Central and South America. There's less demand for labor. And, quite honestly, the longer slaves live in the New World, in North America, what does it mean?
No kids.
They have children, which means you're having an indigenous slave population born. Not as much in Central and South America because of the high mortality rates. Question, Ms. White?
Okay. Is that why, like, I don't know. Never mind.
Okay.
I'll have Jameer send you the information for the one we have for the CTL, okay?
Now, in 1713, we have the famous Treaty of Utrecht. Remember the Treaty of Utrecht? We talked about it. It ends the War of Spanish Succession. It's when Louis XIV had to make a compromise. His grandson got to be King of Spain. One of the key elements of that was that the British, remember me highlighting it? The British got to sell goods in Spanish ports. Not really in Spain, but in Central and South America. And I asked, what did they sell? They sold slaves. The British knocked the Portuguese, they knocked the Dutch out of the slave trade and they take it over. When they do that, under British shipping conditions, slave mortality rates reach 20 to 30% per voyage. That means you're losing 1/5 to 1/3 of your slave population in transit.
So before that, the Dutch. And then you're-
During the Dutch, you had about a 10% mortality rate, 12%. The key, of course, unfortunately, the tragedy, the key is a British slave ship. What they would do is they would actually chain the slaves head to foot so that they could maximize the number of slaves. They were chained so they couldn't move for the entire voyage. And unfortunately, we have a lot of accounts of storms that hit the British slavers. And when the ship sinks, all the slaves go down. $7,000 slaves a year onto the Dutch. 1630, after 1713, from 1713 to 1800, by 1800, 7.6 million slaves have been taken out of Africa. If you do the math, at 7,000 a year, how long would it take you to get to 1 million? 10 years would only be 70,000. 100 years, 700,000. So they reached 7.6 million, 7,600,000 slaves in about 90 years. Now, that's how many slaves showed up in the New World. That doesn't take into account how many died on the journey or how many were killed as those African kingdoms were trying to conquer them. We estimate, and this is just an estimate, it could be low, it could be high, it's just a best guess. We estimate that 12 million Africans died basically from about the 1500s until the 1700s. Or, excuse me, till the 1800s. So 12 million people in about 300 years. Eventually, slavery is outlawed by the British. The British outlaw slavery after the 1800s. They outlawed. And the last place that slavery takes place in the Western world will be America. And it will be outlawed, of course, in the 1860s, 1865.
Did you say the British outlawed it?
They outlawed it first, yes. It became illegal to transport slaves. What year did it become illegal? I don't have that on my outline here. I think it's around the 1830s, I think, 1820s.
Why did they?
Why did they outlaw slavery?
1836.
Was it 1836 in the British Empire? Why did they outlaw slaves?
For the war.
What war?
Civil War.
Well, that's 1865. Why did the British outlaw slaves?
Cost more money.
Because slavery was no longer making money for them. We'll talk about it.
Pay taxes and stuff. Slavery eventually.
Yeah,
Slaves and-
we'll talk about it when we talk about the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution signals pretty much the death of slavery. And we'll talk about why and how.
I probably am gonna have to order some more office chairs.
So what can we say? The African Holocaust claimed as many as approximately, it could be 20 million people. We don't know. Now, one thing we might not think about is when that slave trade ended, what happened to the Africans? What happened to those kingdoms that were trading slaves?
And I run away.
Their economy just disappeared. Their sole source of income was trading slaves. So when they couldn't trade slaves anymore, their governments imploded.
They didn't get money, they just got guns.
Well, mostly they wanted guns. I mean, what good is money? I mean, if you live in Canada or you live in someplace else, what good is money from someplace else if it's not made out of gold? We see a destabilization of all those interior African kingdoms that the Europeans couldn't get to. The Africans got to them. The coastal Africans came in and destroyed them. Then, when the slave trade ends, those African kingdoms that were powerful, who had guns, well, they were powerful against other Africans, weren't they? They were not powerful against Europeans. And so their economies crumbled. 10 million Africans captured and traded. 5 million died in transit. And we have no idea of how many died during the warfare. No idea. When it's all said and done, what does the transatlantic slave trade mean? Well, Africa was basically depopulated. Africa, its population, had been leached away for more than 300 years. The only thing the Western world needed, the only thing the Europeans needed, was a cure for malaria, which they came up with. And after the 1800s, they're going to take all of Africa. And they're going to basically divvy it up to whoever wants it. Pieces go to this country, chunks go to that country. It doesn't matter. It all gets divided up. There's only 2 areas in Africa that were not divided up. Ethiopia and a place called Liberia. Does anyone know what Liberia is? Liberia was an American colony created by the American government to house freed slaves. The American government wanted to ship them back to Africa. Wanted to ship slaves back to Africa to get rid of them. And so they created a place called Liberia. Only those 2 areas were the only areas that the Europeans left alone.
Why?
Well, Ethiopia defended itself against the Italians. And Liberia carried with it a penalty or carried with it American interests. So we basically told the European powers we would not be happy if they didn't leave them alone. So the effects of the transatlantic slave trade they're not only a dramatic, a catastrophic loss of life and population. it also sets the stage for Western expansion. Whole areas of Africa were depleted of population and just left there, waiting for someone to move in. So that kind of brings us up to the state of affairs in Asia, India, and Africa as we approach the 1750s, the 1700s, and a little bit beyond. Basically depopulated. Africa, its population had been leached away for more than 300 years. The only thing the Western world needed, the only thing the Europeans needed, was a cure for malaria, which they came up with. And after the 1800s, they're going to take all of Africa. And they're going to basically divvy it up to whoever wants it. Pieces go to this country, chunks go to that country. It doesn't matter. It all gets divided up. There's only two areas in Africa that were not divided up. Ethiopia and a place called Liberia. Does anyone know what Liberia is? Liberia was an American colony created by the American government to house freed slaves. The American government wanted to ship them back to Africa. Wanted to ship slaves back to Africa to get rid of them. And so they created a place called Liberia. Only those two areas were the only areas that the Europeans left alone.
Why?
Well, Ethiopia defended itself against the Italians. And Liberia carried with it a penalty, or carried with it American interests. So we basically told the European powers we would not be happy if they didn't leave them alone. So the effects of the transatlantic slave trade they're not only a dramatic, a catastrophic loss of life and population, it also sets the stage for Western expansion. Whole areas of Africa were depleted of population and just left there, waiting for someone to move in. So that kind of brings us up to the state of affairs in Asia, India, and Africa as we approach the 1750s, the 1700s, and a little bit beyond.